Thanks everyone for coming back for another session of the course Critical Race Theory and the Politics of Teaching About Racism. We've had some fascinating speakers and dealt with some really interesting subjects. For example, what is critical race theory after all? Everybody's talked about it, everybody has condemned it or has praised it. But what is it? And so we found out that it originated in the universities among law schools. We had a speaker, Kevin Brown, who was involved in the original groups that developed critical race theory. We've heard about how the law has been put in place that reflects condemnation of critical race theory and the way that supposedly it's being used to teach history. And so today we're proud to welcome back Professor Paul Ortiz to address how critical race theory and the teaching of history has been dealt with throughout the United States, how issues of racism have been incorporated into our history curriculum and how it differs from state to state. This, of course, is a time that is quite important for us in Florida because our governor is using the period to take a look at how colleges are dealing with diversity, equity, and inclusion, trying to pull back funding for these types of activities. He's stopped the advanced placement course dealing with African American studies from being used as a pilot in the high schools. So these issues are so relevant to our lives today, and look forward to Paul addressing some of these issues from a perspective of how they're being taught across the U.S. Professor Ortiz, go ahead.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Rick, so much. A very kind introduction. I'm just really thrilled to be back here again, twice in less than a month, which meant that at least on 2 occasions in the past month, I had an amazing lunch and incredible lunchtime conversation today with Rick, Lynn, and Jane. It's just so much, I feel so privileged and blessed to be able to return to Oak Hammock. And I also wanted to say at the outset, just thank you so much. Many of you have granted oral history interviews to many of our students in the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program over the past year, over the past several years. And I wanted to share with you that when I mentioned that I was going to be lecturing at Oak Hammock today, a couple of our students said, "Oh yeah, I interviewed a resident of Oak Hammock last year. And I learned so much." And one of the things they learned, and I said, well, because I'm a teacher, I said, well, what did you learn? And they said, without skipping a beat, I learned that our university has traditions, really important traditions. And so, I mean, thank you again for sitting down with our students. I think most of the interviews we did last year were via Zoom. But it's really those traditions we've been talking a lot about, I think, during this fabulous series. I really wish I would have been able to just watch the entire series and not even present, because I feel like the way ILR does programs in terms of thinking about the most critical issues of our time, but always how those issues are rooted somehow in history. And so I want to do a little bit of show and tell to start things, because my charge today was to talk about how ideas that kind of circulate around and are connected to critical race theory are being taught now. in universities and colleges, et cetera, et cetera. So just to show you how they're being taught at the University of Florida, there's two different handouts, but these are also invitations. And so, Rick, can we pass these out now to folks? And so the first is, we have two public programs. The Proctor program is sponsoring in February, and one is a book signing for a book called State on Freedom. And that book recounts the life of one of our beloved professors of African American Studies, Zohara Simmons, who retired a few years ago. But before that, in the early 60s, she was an organizer with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Mississippi. She helped develop the Freedom School curriculum. She was there at Freedom Summer. And so we're having a program where there's going to be a book signing. Dan Berger, a dear colleague of mine at the University of Washington, just finished a book about Zohara and her husband Michael's organizing life, their history in the movement over a period of several decades. So that's going to be on February 23rd at 5 p.m., Smathers Library East. You're welcome to join us there. There will be a reception, or you can join us via Zoom. So there's two public programs. The other one we're having at the Cotton Club. We, as you know, with the Proctor program, we try to connect UF and the broader community. And so we're excited about this program on February 13th. And again, this is an example, when I think of critical race theory and concepts like diversity, equity, and inclusion, the reason we pursue these things and assign value to these things, because we do this in part because these are the achievements that people in this room have fought for and struggled for over the years. And some of you, for example, may have been, I feel like I'm recapping a lot of this vibrant lunch discussion we had with Jane, Lynn, and Rick. But some of you may have attended a public program that the Proctor program sponsored a few weeks ago, where we rolled out the Presidential Task Force report on African Native American history. So in the summer of 2020, President Fox asked me to co-chair a task force that would explore UF's history with Native and African American communities from 1853 to present. That is looking at our different antecedents, the Florida Seminary, et cetera, et cetera. So when we rolled that out and gave that report, it was a great task force, by the way. Carl Van Ness, our recently retired university historian, who really trained me when I was a grad student at Duke, and I started doing research here in the 90s. Wynn Phillips, who recently retired, many of you know. Hazel Levy, an incredible medical researcher. And as we were giving our presentation about this 110-page task force report on African and Native American history, much of which could be accused of being about critical race theory or the study of racism, the study of anti-racism, et cetera, as we were giving this panel report, and it was my turn to speak, I said, as I look out in this audience of people, all devoted and connected to the University of Florida in one way or the other, I can't help but recognize the fact that, 80 or 50, or in some cases even 30 years ago, most of us wouldn't be in this room today if we were women, if we were Black, if we were Jewish, if we were Catholic, because UF was not originally built for us. But over the generations, because of the efforts of administrators, faculty, parents, students, et cetera, now it is built for us. Now we are the legacy of this university. And I remember interviewing Madeline Lockhart, one of the first oral history interviews that I did when I arrived at the University of Florida. And Dr. Lockhart told me some really powerful stories about when she first tried to go up for tenure here in the early 1960s. And what her administration told her, well, Madeline, And by then she has a reputation she has a national reputation as a scholar. And her administrator told her at the time in the early 60s, well, Madeline, if it was up to me, I'd allow you to compete for tenure. The problem is you make your male colleagues very uncomfortable. And so just can't do it. So she left, but then eventually returned. And the rest, as they say, is history. She rose herself to become a nationally prominent scholar, an administrator, and really a great benefactor to our university. You walk throughout the University of Florida, and there's a Madeline Lockhart new book collection at the Smathers. She endowed a number of graduate student fellowships, et cetera, et cetera. She supported gender studies. That wasn't her field necessarily, but she ascribed an importance to the study of inequality, but then how do we get equal? How do we bring the society together so we all feel welcome? And that's part of what I feel is under fire right now. When you talk about attacking critical race theory, today I'm going to connect critical race theory to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I grew up, my father was the chair of the Hispanic Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, one of the world's greatest shipyards. We serviced the USS Enterprise, USS Nimitz, great nuclear aircraft carriers. We serviced a big part of the Polaris, Trident-class nuclear submarine fleets. Each of those submarines had enough firepower, ICBMs, to destroy the continent of Europe, just one submarine. But my father, with his seventh grade education, was responsible for using affirmative action and the principles of equal employment opportunity to help promote Hispanic workers from being apprentices to journeymen to, master craftsmen, as they called them back in the day, pipe fitters, carpenters, joiners, electricians, people who got on those ships and repaired those ships and made them work so they could be seaworthy again. But none of that happened without struggle. It didn't happen without, you had to have lawsuits. You had to file grievances. You had to sometimes push back against the state. Because a lot of people thought that Hispanics were good for one thing. When I was growing up, we were good for manual labor. We were good for picking crops. We were good for, cooking, baking, or, cleaning dishes. And not saying we couldn't do those things. Certainly my parents did. But the idea behind equal employment opportunity and affirmative action was, what if we studied? What if we had the ability to teach, or to be a professor, or to be a master carpenter? Shouldn't we have the right to do that? But to get to that point where my father was able to help other Hispanic workers rise in their professions, in their crafts, to get to a point now at the University of Florida where women faculty feel welcomed, where students of color feel welcomed, where LGBT students feel that this is their university. It took a lot of work. And that was what was reflected in that task force report. And that's what's reflected in the whole study of critical race theory and diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. The idea is things don't happen by magic. You have to really struggle for them. Are you going to hurt people's feelings sometimes? Yes, you will. Think about how you have made the transition from being an all-male white Protestant university at first to just being an all-white male university that accepted Catholic students. That was a big deal. Most of us don't know that history, and I won't bore you with it, but it's fascinating. Because it was still an all-male institution, still all white, but there was a little progress that was made. I think Catholic students should have the right to go here. Okay, I mean, that sounds reasonable now, but try making that pitch in 1920 in the state of Florida, with a governor like Sidney Katz, the governor of Florida, who campaigned on anti-Catholicism and anti-Blackness. That is, he claimed, and this is very popular in America at the time, he said the Negroes and the Catholics have a plot together to undermine our institutions. I don't know what it is because they're so secretive, but we're going to stop them. And that was 3/4 of the man's platform when he ran for governor in 1916. The Negro Catholic conspiracy. And unfortunately, at the time, our university bought into it. One of the lessons in the task force report is that when you have listens to parents and students and staff and faculty, we move forward. When all we do is look at what's happening in Tallahassee, whoever happens to be in that seat in office, and all we do is look and try to please that person, we stop moving forward. And because we're not thinking about what's good for our students, we're not thinking about what's good for our alumni, our community. We're only worried about what's happening or what that man in office or woman in office is thinking at that time, what their expectations are for us. What I told a reporter yesterday was, I think AP or CBS or something, and she said, well, what do you think Governor DeSantis' wishes are for the University of Florida at this moment? And I said, in all honesty, I can't tell you. You'll have to ask him. But I can tell you one thing I know for sure. This university is going to be around. It's going to thrive. It's going to grow long into the future, long after people forget who was governor of Florida in 2023. Now, I can say that because as a historian of the state, people don't remember who the governor was 8 years ago. So it's kind of a logical statement. Anyway, I feel like I'm starting to ramble, so let me get back on script. So I wanted to share with you some slides here and actually give you a little bit of surprise because in the lunch, I told my lunch colleagues they can't say anything because there is a little bit of a surprise here. I wanted to run you through what Hispanic Heritage Month lecture looks like. This is very typical within a university kind of setting. And so, as my wife Sheila can tell you, a lot of you know Sheila, my busiest time of the year is either, it's a tie now between Hispanic Heritage Month and Black History Month. Before COVID, I was always gone. Thank heavens for Zoom, because now I do a lot of this on Zoom. I mean, I couldn't do it if it wasn't for Zoom. But when I'm asked to give a talk in Hispanic Heritage Month, this is often how I start. And so this is actually a talk from 2022. I begin by introducing some key characters in Hispanic or Latino history, Cesar Chavez in this case, or Emeterio Yuca. People know who Cesar Chavez is. So a trick that historians try to do, or any kind of narrative person does, is you start with the obvious, with people's comfort level. Chances are most people know who Cesar Chavez was, right? So you kind of start there. Because I'm a historian, I can't help but give you a pop quiz. I'm going to ask you to look over this slide here. This is a very typical kind of talk that I give for Hispanic Heritage Month. And I'm going to ask you as you're looking over this to guess where I gave this talk at. If you get the right answer, what prize can I give? The lunch crowd can't. UF? Okay, that's a good guess. A university? Like what part of the country? Just kind of, there's no wrong answer. We're at the there's no wrong answer phase here. California? Okay, that's a good guess. Another hint, I didn't pick any of these themes. I didn't pick diversity of people. I did not pick intersectionality, which, by the way, 28 presidents of Florida colleges last week came out and said, We're abolishing intersectionality from our campuses. We'll get it done by the end of Black History Month. We're abolishing intersectionality. But these were all prompts that I was given. You know how students ask you for prompt, what's the prompt? So these are the prompts that I get typically from a university, and they'll say, we want you to come and be our keynote for Black History or Hispanic Heritage Month, but these are the key themes: diversity of people, intersectionality, what Latinx people are contributing beyond notions of assimilation, and importance of heritage. Now, I would argue with you that a lot of these themes are what the state of Florida is trying to stamp out now, especially in these attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Okay, any more guesses about who this talk was given for? Texas, okay, that would be good. That's a good guess. Florida, okay, very good guess. This talk was given for the ConAgra Corporation last year, the multi-billion-dollar food processing corporation. But I wanted to share this with you because this is what they came up with. They gave me the prompts. They wanted me to talk about diversity. They wanted me to talk about intersectionality. I didn't pick those topics. I was happy to talk about them. But this is where corporate America is right now. I've given talks at, let me share one more slide with you. So this is another typical example. I'm glad as a historian, it occurs to me sometimes, Paul, save that email. Because I had this epiphany this morning. So this is another corporation I recently gave a talk to. I also believe it was Hispanic Heritage Month from this past year. Oh, well, it tells you right there, that's the email. Guggenheim Partners, some of you may do business with them. It's a major investment firm. This is what they're looking for. And you see right away the kind of welcoming, the kind of themes they really want me to focus on: celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month, given your body of work, African American and Latinx history in the United States. This is where the corporate world is at now. They're all about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Their employees have critical race theory book clubs where they read books by Toni Morrison or Kimberly Crenshaw or Derek Bell, some of the people I know that have come up during the course of the series. The reason I mention this is that the people fighting, the people at the state who want to stop our students from having the right to learn these things, the people in the state that are trying to repress those things, and by the way, a lot of them are from out of the state. That's where the funding is. It's really not even primarily from Florida, places like Pasadena, California. But the people trying to stop what we're doing at UF in terms of things like gender studies, in terms of things like intersectionality, bringing people together. By the way, I took a group of University of Florida students from the Proctor program last week to the Eastern Shore of Maryland to work with the National Park Service in conducting oral history interviews with descendants of the Underground Railroad, freedom seekers, conductors, station masters. The idea is that we know almost less than zero about how the Underground Railroad actually operated because it was secret. Because even decades after the end of the Civil War, when some enterprising reporter from the New York Times would show up at your doorstep, at a small Quaker community in a corner of a Maryland county and say, well, ma'am or sir, I understand that, before the war, you were a way station for the Underground Railroad. What would that person tell them? Oh, yes, I would. No. Well, of course they would. Because even admitting that you were active in the Underground Railroad in states like Maryland or Delaware or heaven forbid, Florida, decades after the war could get you killed. So you didn't admit it. You never, I mean, occasionally you'll find someone who'll say, oh yeah, I was part of it. They better have a gun to defend themselves. I'll just leave it there. But we had the chance to interview these amazing descendants. We interviewed, and to see our students kind of do these interviews, as you know, my goal in oral history is, I train students. I'm happy to do interviews, but I've done thousands of them. So for me as a teacher, the goal is to get that student out there interviewing a World War II veteran or the founder of a business or, retired university professor, whatever it might be. So to see my students, they're interviewing a descendant of Thomas Garrett. And I'm having to kind of pinch myself. Thomas Garrett helped free 2,700 slaves on the Underground Railroad. He was a Quaker. He was a close friend of Harriet Tubman. He was a close friend of Frederick Douglass. And by the way, Roy, I'm thinking a summer read for us, The Narrative of Frederick Douglass. It's one of the great literary productions in this country's history that just popped in my mind. By the way, writing up the Science Hill, it's amazing how many creative thoughts come to one when you have a minor deprivation of oxygen. Like, why don't we read The Narrative of Frederick Douglass this summer? Wouldn't that be fun? But to see our students talking to a person who's a descendant of Thomas Garrett, oh my gosh, I was in historian's heaven. But that's an example of intersectionality. Black and white people, Hispanic people working together, fighting, dare I say it, systemic racism. That's what slavery was. It was a system of racism. It wasn't a matter of even individual choice. There were tens of thousands of slave owners. I'm not going to go through a list of slave owners in 1845 in Maryland and Virginia and try to figure out how they chose to be a slave owner. That's an interesting project, but that would take centuries. This is why we study oppression as a system and the Underground Railroad as a social movement to end that system of oppression. So I've just thrown out a bunch of terms that have recently been banned in Florida. Again, the 28 college presidents stated that they're ending critical race theory, they're ending intersectionality, and other things too. And the main takeaway here is that they're doing our students a terrible disservice because this is the world that our students are going into. ConAgra, Guggenheim Partners. In the last 2 years alone, I've given talks to Microsoft, Bank of America, Deutsche Bank. And in every case, these are the themes I'm asked to talk about. And in every single case, at the end of the Q&A, and these are generally international, remote Zoom things, because, Deutsche obviously has branches all over the world. There'll be kind of a silence at the end of the Q&A, and then, the VP of HR will pipe in. He'll say, well, Professor Ortiz, we don't want to make you feel like you're being taken advantage of here, but how do we get more of your University of Florida students to apply to our firm? How can we make that happen? And I'll say, well, this is how you make it happen. You do events like this. This is what our students want to. They want to be proud of where they came from. They want their parents' heritages. They want their mothers' and their fathers' stories to be things that they can be proud of. They don't want to have to assimilate to some kind of imaginary, thing they can't even aspire to. They want to be able to bring their identities into the workplace and feel welcomed and included. So just do what you're doing, essentially. HR is not my field, by the way. When people, how do we recruit more? I write a lot of letters of recommendation, though. So I'm going to wrap up actually really soon because we'll leave time for Q&A. But again, this notion of intersectionality is a key part of critical race theory. And I think I talked about this a little bit last time. But what it means is it means going across borders, going across nations, traversing across languages, and finding ways in which people connect with each other over time. That's what I do as a historian. You know, if you're environmental studies, if you're literary studies, you do things differently. But these individuals, I'll often do kind of pop quizzes with folks, but you know, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Antonio Maceo, he was the leader of the Cuban Revolution in the 1890s, or actually really from the 1870s to 1890s, and he died in battle fighting the Spanish. Reverend Lena Mason, who used her immense stature as a Christian evangelical leader to promote the cause of women's freedom in Cuba in the 1880s and 1890s. And Jose Marti, the great Cuban patriot, who died fighting for the independence of Cuba. All four of these individuals connect with each other in the sense that all four of them were working on common projects. Even though they spoke different languages, they were from different countries. One of the many connections was that Jose Marti, as a Cuban writer, exiled from his own nation, forced to flee to Mexico. If he would have stayed in Cuba, the Spanish would have executed him. And in Mexico, he wrote these incredible exposés of anti-Black lynching in the 1880s. Just powerful. And what was amazing to me researching these is he was writing in Spanish what Ida B. Wells Barnett was writing about in English. And their depictions of these atrocities were very similar. You could almost, I do this in class when I teach my African diaspora seminar, I put them side by side and I have students look at them and I say, isn't it interesting that Jose Marti is writing from almost a Latin American perspective about anti-Black lynching, and he's really coming up with the same kind of analyses that Ida B. Wells Barnett is coming up with. And the first important point is he gives the victims of lynching a voice. He is concerned with making sure that the person who is on the verge of being burned alive or lynched has the opportunity to speak. And that's what Ida B. Wells was all about too. But that wasn't what the New York Times was about. That wasn't what the Washington Post was about. When you read the New York Times accounts of lynching, the victim of the lynching never has a voice. He or she is just a passive object of history. And that's what Jose Marti and Ida B. Wells Barnett fought to change. So this is kind of the classic, when I do Hispanic Heritage Month lecture, to talk about some of the different nations of Latin America that our students hail from, and to kind of think about U.S. history as a history of the Americas, as an intersectional kind of history. But what I want to do now, I can't help myself. I promise I'm going to put myself in check. I'm just going to talk about two or three more slides. I may have talked a little bit about this, Rick, at the last talk, but I wanted to share with you a new research find for me this summer at the National Archives. I'm working on a project with Ibram Kendi called Created Unequal. I think I may have mentioned it and last time, but I kind of just, in many ways, rediscovered this legendary figure in Hispanic or Latino history, Jose Manuel Gallegos. And he's certainly important as an individual. He's the first Hispanic elected to be a territorial delegate in U.S. history. Later, he will be elected to the U.S. Congress. But as a boy, as a child, he was born into Mexico. But as a young man coming of age, training to become a priest, now he's in the United States because this is in the wake of the Mexican-American War. And he grows up primarily in New Mexico. He becomes a trusted priest. His main constituency are Pueblo Indians. And apparently I'll say he was a good priest and a bad priest. He was a good priest in the sense that the people he worked with loved him and kind of followed him his entire life. Bad priest in the sense that he ended up having a number of affairs and leaving the priesthood. And that was his entree into politics. And how I discovered him quite by accident was I was looking through these boxes of contested election cases from New Mexico territory in the 1850s, 1860s, boxes of these affidavits, testimonies. Doesn't that sound exciting? Doesn't it make you want to go out and become a historian? You know? And I'm reading through this, I'm thinking, why are all these white supremacist Democrats going after him? I mean, they are fighting a war against him being elected. And they're especially outraged because the base of his support are Pueblo Indians in New Mexico territory. And his opponents are saying Indians shouldn't even have the right to vote. They're not American citizens. That's another topic. But I wanted to share this with you because Representative Gallegos lived the courage of his convictions. He gave these fiery speeches against slavery. They all were in Spanish. As far as I can tell, he spoke maybe 5 words of English his entire life. So, we have to translate these. But, I mean, he's such a powerful anti-slavery speaker. And you can see 1862, well, the war has already broken out. Arizona has already seceded to join the Confederacy. New Mexico territory is next. But he says, not over my dead body. Our people, our Mexican people, our Indian people, we embrace democracy. We abhor slavery. We know what that system is. We fought a war, our elders fought a war of independence to get rid of that system. Now we're Americans, which means we're anti-slavery. It's not a debate. It's just who we are. And so the Confederacy actually kidnaps this man. He's a POW the entire Civil War. They don't kill him. They want to kill him, but they realize if they execute him, it's not going to go very well for them in New Mexico territory because of his popularity with Native Americans. So a great example of intersectionality. Another one, the leading Puerto Rican political organization in 1940, the women's group auxiliary of that organization, writes a powerful letter to FDR thanking him for promoting Colonel Benjamin Davis Sr. to the rank of Brigadier General. Now, most of us in history know General Davis's son, who also becomes a General Davis. That son, that general, is the leader of the Tuskegee Airmen. This is his father. And this is a Puerto Rican women's organization that writes to President Roosevelt and says, thank you for doing the right thing. You have gained the support of people of color all over the world for promoting this black man to a position he should have had all along. I mean, military historians now say, yeah, Davis should have been a general a long time before 1940. So thanks for doing the right thing. And this is the last slide. And I may have shared this with some of you before, but this is another great example of intersectionality. And I think it points out the tragedy of what's happening now in Florida when you have college presidents saying, we're not going to allow the consideration of intersectionality. This is a black congressman, Mickey Leland, who my parents and grandparents knew as Mexican-American constituents of Mickey Leland. When Barbara Jordan kind of stepped down, Mickey Leland was the person who was seen as kind of inheriting her incredible stature in some ways. Mickey Leland was beloved by Mexican-Americans in Harris County, Texas, Houston. And this is another dramatic moment in U.S. history where things could have went either way. This was a congressional hearing where the Voting Rights Act was being debated. And a group of legislators wanted to eliminate the foreign language provisions of the Voting Rights Act, which essentially say that, if you're holding an election in a community where everyone or most people speak a different language, you're required to create voting materials in that language. And you can imagine in cities like Miami-Dade, if you don't have this, a lot of people are not going to be able to vote, right? And so the whole foreign language provision, though, was under threat. The Republicans, in this case, wanted to end it because they saw that, they're like, we're not benefiting from this because most of these people who speak foreign languages for some reason are not voting Republican. Why was that? That's another topic. So at a really dire moment in this debate, Mickey Leland, a black man, gets up in the middle of the debate, and I'm still trying to figure out, was this something he was planning in advance? Or was this an epiphany or spur of the moment? This is why it's so exciting to be a historian. Like, I'm not sure now, I can't tell the answer, but what I do know is he gets up in the middle of this debate with people we now know in the history books, and he says, look, he starts in English, and then he code switches to Spanish. And it's so stunning to these Congress people because they're like, a black man who speaks Spanish? We didn't know that even existed. And he just essentially kind of shames his colleagues. He says, just because you speak a different language doesn't mean you're any less American than people who speak English. And apparently it's so shocking. The descriptions we have from the newspapers are that suddenly Congress people all over the House floor start getting up and speaking in foreign languages. One legislator gets up and speaks in Italian. And it's almost like wow, was this a miracle? Like, I grew up in an evangelical tradition where people spoke in tongues. And I'm just kind of imagining this, Anyway, it saved the day. However he came to that moment in his life, and however he came to that moment of the decision to code switch from English to Spanish, saved the day. That was according to the people who were there. They said up to that point, they said, one of the things that another congressperson said, Mickey Leland made it real. He made me realize, it shouldn't matter if people in Miami speak Spanish or another language. If they're citizens, they should be able to engage in voting. So anyway, these are some of the ways that my mentors taught me how to do history. And I guess the final thing I'll share with you is that two of my mentors were even named in Governor DeSantis' attack against AP African American history. One of them was Angela Davis. The first two dissertation committees I served on at UC Santa Cruz, Angela Davis was the chair of those committees. I treasure the fact that I was mentored. She was one of my amazing mentors. We remain friends. The most gracious, kind person you will ever meet. Just incredible. The first month I was on campus, I was terrified. Santa Cruz has this long tradition where your first month, you have to give a campus-wide lecture. Imagine being a junior faculty having to do that. So I go up to give my campus-wide lecture. It's on my dissertation. Fall of 2001. Who's sitting in the front row of my talk? Angela Davis. I was terrified. I'm like, oh my gosh, I got major imposter syndrome. She walks up to me before I even started speaking, and she said, Paul, I just want to welcome you to Santa Cruz. We're so honored that you joined the faculty. I wanted to start crying. She was mentioned in the governor's attack on AP African American Studies. He said, well, she was a member at one point of the communist and socialist parties, so we got to get her out of the curriculum. That's a travesty. I studied the Great Depression. I studied people like Francis Perkins, FDR, these larger-than-life figures. Were some of them at one point in the Socialist or Communist Party? Yes, many of them were. But it's not my job to create a litmus test to decide whether or not I'm going to include or exclude a person from American history. And that's where the state of Florida went over the line, way over the line. when I teach about early U.S. history, by 1776, the anti-slavery movement is a century and a half old. So when I have people like Thomas Jefferson, pro-slavery, James Madison, pro-slavery, people who supported really atrocious things, I don't take them out of my lectures because they were slaveholders. That would be absurd. They belong there because they made history. They're an integral part of this nation's history. So this idea that you take people out because you didn't like their party affiliation is an abomination. It's a travesty. And the state of Florida knows this. I better stop talking, Roy, because I'll just get on a hobby horse about this. Anyway, thank you for your great patience. Yeah, right. Okay. Anyway, thanks for your patience. I'll be happy to take Q&A. I really appreciate the time, opportunity. Yeah.
Hold on.
Oh, the mic for the Zoom audience. Very good. Hey, John, I see you up there. Hey, Paul, great to see you. You're the only people I see. But anyway.
This is a comment. This week, I happened upon a PBS program which dealt with the Freedom Trail in Canada, in Lower Canada. And I had never thought about Canada in that context, but there are several small museums in the communities where blacks ended up in Canada, and invariably the directors were of those small museums are descendants of slaves. And again, it was just a fascinating part of that story, which I did not know.
Yeah, it's incredible. I tell, a lot of times people will say, well, I didn't know about that. And I'll say, well, yeah, I didn't know about that either, until, way later in life. It wasn't something, we didn't study the Underground Railroad when I was in school that I remember. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul, for a wonderful talk. In line with what was just said, I lived in a small town upstate New York, about an hour north of Scranton, Pennsylvania. The name of the town was Owego, not Otsego and not Oswego, but Owego. And it was along the Susquehanna River. And the homes across the street from us were stately mansions. And a number of them had tunnels from the river into their basements. Wow. They were on the Underground Railroad. And I believe they were people on that section that were heading toward Canada. So that's kind of a nice tie-in.
That's a great tie-in. One of the people we interviewed, our students interviewed, was Tony Cohen. And he had two ancestors from different sides of the family that fled to freedom through the Underground Railroad. And in the 90s, he actually retraced their steps. The first pathway was from the eastern shore of Maryland up into Niagara Falls, and then across to Canada to freedom. And the other ancestor escaped from Baltimore, eventually to Detroit, and then across the water. So what Mr. Cohen did in the 90s, and I remember reading about this in grad school, I didn't, it took me a while to connect this. But what he did was he retraced his ancestors' steps, walking. It's one thing to drive from the eastern shore of Maryland to New York. That seems a long drive. To walk it? You all know, some of you know the terrain in the eastern shore. It's a big swamp. It's rough walking. But anyway, he actually retraced his ancestors' roots. I think it was the park services of both countries got together, and they actually made boats available for him. So he actually crossed over in a boat in both cases, like his ancestors. Yeah. He said that surprised him. He said, I didn't really grow up boating, and they had this boat. I'm like, what am I supposed to do? And they're like, get in the boat. Just a wonderful person. Our students just loved him.
Good afternoon, Paul.
Great to see you, buddy.
Good to see you. I don't know how the governor intends to implement his policies, whether he's going to do it legislatively or whether he's going to do it through the Board of Governors and Trustees of the various universities. But how do you intend, or do you intend in any way to alter your presentations? And do you feel like the other, your colleagues in political science that are obviously teaching in opposition of where the governor is, what do you think they intend to do in the future?
The state is trying to scare us. You know, tragically, like I'm a full professor, I have tenure, I have a collective bargaining contract. Article 10 of that collective bargaining contract is academic freedom, rights, and responsibilities. That's my protection, or I should say our protection. But think about our graduate students who have these precious opportunities to learn how to become, college instructors. They don't have that protection. They have a collective bargaining agreement, but they don't have it like us. Think about our lecturers. Think about the staff. Think about people in counseling who have LGBT students that they're trying to work with. So what's happening so far, and Mr. Scherstein, I apologize, I'm kind of scattered here. What's happening so far is, yes, people have altered their syllabi, not just here, but all throughout the state of Florida and in the colleges too. They pulled back readings. I mentioned Toni Morrison. There's a lot less Toni Morrison being taught now than there was a year ago, even on the college level. Now, I haven't heard anyone at UF, say, I'm not going to teach Toni Morrison, right? But I've heard it from colleagues at other institutions. So it's already happening. There's a fear factor. What we need is what's been happening up to this point that really has been our saving grace, again, is people like you. When you step up and you make your views known to your representatives, to the governor, to Tigard Hall, and you affirm that holding this series is a statement. We want the people who participate in ILR education programs are curious about critical race theory. We think we should have the right to decide, not the governor. If it was up to the governor, we wouldn't be doing this right now. All right. It's banned. Like in K through 12, you can't talk about critical race theory. So we approach this, like, as you know, probably know, I'm the president of the faculty union. And the way I think about this growing up again in a shipyard town is that the union contract is binding on both sides. It requires the University of Florida to proactively defend academic freedom. That's what the contract says. It requires us as faculty to uphold the traditions of academic freedom. That's a big responsibility. I think if you don't have academic freedom, nothing else really matters. So that's what we're doing, but we're really depending on your support, because I can tell you that Tigard Hall gets, I live right down the street from a retired, I live right down the street from Bernie Manchin, and I have former presidents call me and say, Paul, what's the union doing to protect the integrity of this university? And I'm so grateful to get those calls from people. And I've had former board of trustee member. I've had a former Republican governor call me and say, Paul, what's the union doing? We're putting our hope in the collective bargaining agreement. And I'm thinking, I never heard this individual ever say a good word about unions their entire political career. But I'm glad they're on our side now. I'm sure glad they're on our side now, because it's going to take all of us, again, coming together, remembering what it took us to make this place more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive. And yeah, we have a ways to go, or we still have a long journey, and it's going to be, throughout my entire life, but a lot of this for me as a historian is remembering where we came from. And I just had a couple of opportunities to talk to Sam Proctor before Sam passed away, I think in 2006. And one of those conversations, and this was before I was here on campus, and many of you knew Sam Proctor. And I remember one of the things he told me, I asked him about his book about Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. People don't know, Sam was the preeminent biographer of this larger-than-life Republican governor. And thankfully, I had read the book before I talked to Sam. I was still a grad student at Duke, and we started talking about, he said, well, what do you know about Governor Broward? I said, well, sir, I know this and this and this because I read your book. Thank God. And he said, well, there's one thing you need to know about Broward. And I was actually just starting out my dissertation research. He kind of leaned over and he said, Governor Broward hated Black people. And that's the key to understanding his entire career. He hated Black people. Now, I already kind of knew that from the book, but having, again, that guidance, and Sam Proctor told me that because he felt as a senior professor and historian, that's what I needed to know at that point in my career as a junior person. Now, again, if the state of Florida knew about that, they'd just say, oh, no, don't talk about that. That might make some people feel bad. But we're in the business of kind of shaking things up, challenging people's ideas. I promised I wouldn't go on too long. Last time I went way too long, my response.
All right, let's take John from Zoom. Go ahead.
Yeah, I hate to correct a historian, but Broward was a Democrat.
Yeah.
Republican.
You're right.
But this morning I was having my coffee and listening to WUFT-FM, and they mentioned that the governor has now banned any expenditures for DEI programs. And I was drinking out of this cup, which you can see here is a anti-racist coalition sponsored by the College of Education. This was in the early 1990s. So when he's banning expenditure for DEI programs, that's programs, but it doesn't block people from talking about DEI, I trust. And I know you are vigilant when it comes to faculty making comments that might get them into trouble because we have the contract. So I was just wondering, to me, so much of this is posturing by the governor. It's poisoning a whole bunch of things as well. But I just feel pretty powerless to at the time. I've expressed that last week as well. So we can't even write a letter to the Gainesville Sun anymore. So I'm just venting. So I'd like to get your response to that. Yeah. I can't hear you.
Well, really the thought is that, and this is going to sound, kind of old school, but, a lot of it is getting active politically. The lesson I learned, as a younger labor organizer was, if it's important, then you're going to organize to protect it. And I think that feeling of powerlessness, I agree. I mean, you wake up and it's almost like actually, I didn't read this morning's newspaper because I just don't want to see it. I wanted to wait a little later because you're right, it is about performance. But I think part of what we have to do, John, and this is the political hat. I mean, I wouldn't do this in a classroom, but when I have a chance outside of the classroom to say that this is really all about the 2024 GOP presidential nomination. And let's just be clear, this isn't even a debate. The federal judge, Judge Walker, when he enjoined DeSantis from enforcing the anti-woke law, said, this is about This isn't about a debate, because what you've done with the anti-woke law is you precluded debate. You've excluded people from the option of doing what we're doing now in the ILR, talking about intersectionality and critical race theory. He said, if the state wants to prove that racism doesn't exist, prove it. Okay? But if you can't prove it, you can't just refuse people the opportunity to talk about it. So yeah, John, I think, part of me, I spend half the day hopeless and the other part of the day with hopeful. Maybe it has to do with how much coffee I have. But I'm seriously, I'm hopeful because of you, because you're part of this community, and I see the people on the sidebar and I see the people here. I know we're going to find ways to come together to defend democracy. Over lunch, we were talking about, one of the founders of our union, Hernán Vera, brilliant scholar of race, internationally renowned. Family had to flee from Chile in 1973 because of the Pinochet dictatorship. People like Sam Proctor had a connection to the Holocaust. And those are the people that built this institution. Madeline Lockhart. They understood how far we had to go to become a real world-class university. And we're not going to let that slide. So that may sound, I actually had 3 cups of coffee during lunch, so it helps my hopefulness. But I really do believe that. I think that it's going to take all of our institutions working together, in civil society to really, preserve what we have. But then you alluded to this too, John. I don't want us to forget this. This isn't just about what's happening in the classroom. It's about what's happening to our counselors, to our librarians, to our staff people who are trying to create really good workplaces. And so we have to be cognizant. It isn't just, and what we've said on campus is academic freedom isn't just about defending the tenure of Paul Ortiz. It's about defending our students' rights to study what they want to study.
And it's up to the students and their parents, I would hope, because the deterioration of a university is an extraordinary disappointment to those who've invested their life's savings to send their kids here. So that's another group we should activate. And they've been quite well activated in working to make University Avenue safe. And we've just gotten a grant from $8 million from the federal government to make our roads safe. Now we have to make our education safe.
Yeah, exactly.
Paul, you have time for a few more questions?
Yeah.
Okay, Ophelia, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the clause in the union contract. That contract is renegotiated over a period of years, right? Like
Yes.
it lasts for 3 years at a time, and then you have to renegotiate. So I was just wondering, what is the termination date of the current contract? When does it come up for renegotiation?
So this summer, we'll begin putting, we bargain with the university 24/7 year round. And so we just finished our salary bargaining for the year. The 3-year contract, we call it the full book contract. That's the 30 plus articles.
Right.
We will start anew bargaining for the next 3-year contract, really getting ready to starting next fall.
Well, what I mean is, when is the termination date of the contract? Because they can just decide the next time it comes up that they're going to take away that clause. So you cannot take it in for granted that that clause is going to be there in a couple of years.
Yeah.
And so everybody needs to plan ahead for this, because I see where that is coming, and I see it far more perniciously. I mean, of course, it's a presidential bid to get national attention, but it's a very detailed and comprehensive way from ruling out every notion of critical theory from the law school and the curriculum. Because the previous speaker that we had last week explained that the law, the way it's stated, is so general that faculty are unsure how much can they actually teach of this concept before they are supposed to be in violation of the law. And after I heard her speech that night, I recalled, because it's not just what is banned, like Angela Davis is banned, or Kimberly Crenshaw is banned. It's that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that, yes, you can teach it, but here's how you may teach it. There's only a style of teaching it that is accepted, more or less like if you're an encyclopedia and you're presenting a number of theories and here's one. However, the problem with that, as I saw later, is that, and you cannot, supposedly in the style of teaching, you cannot advocate for critical race theory. This is what, you're prohibited from advocating for. So I thought, and this is, so you're supposed to be like so neutral that nobody knows where you stand on this theory if you're going to start even presenting it. However, a qualification for teaching at an advanced university, at a research university, is that you're granted tenure based on your publication record. And any faculty member who's going to be in the law school or elsewhere in the university teaching a course like this, or even a class on this, has to have already publications and research experience. And this is already well known. So nobody can walk into a classroom pretending that they're just a neutral observer of the theory if the very fact that the way they got their job was through a list of publications that put out for anyone to read what their position was, including their students. So this is why I think this is totally it is comprehensive. It's to the core of your research, your identity, what you can transmit, what you can say, what you cannot say. It's like writing a script of how you're going to teach in the classroom for anybody who has already learned PhDs and doctorates of everything in the world and proven themselves to be able to be an authority on that.
Yeah. Well, and I haven't read this, but my understanding is that the state or the governor, and I wanted to refer to an earlier question too, because someone asked the question, what techniques is the state using to implement this repression of academic and intellectual freedom? And one is they just break the law, and they think that they're above the law. So what's happening in New College, you may be following that. It's the attempt to dismantle an outstanding smaller college. They've already acknowledged that, look, we violated the bylaws. We don't care. Obviously, there are rules that decide who becomes a president or of a college. There are rules governing the employment of faculty and staff. So the people trying to seize control of New College have made it clear, we don't need what was that phrase? We don't need no stinking badges. And so we have to be aware of that also, is that what are the institutions we can rely on to preserve intellectual freedom? I mean, another thing that I did, several colleagues sent me the same article this morning about a parallel college that's being set up at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, that apparently is going to teach what they call conservative values of civic engagement or civic education. And this is another thing that's happening all over the country. It isn't just Florida. It's an effort to create parallel institutions. Now, in an earlier phase of my life, some of you know I was a soldier in U.S. Special Forces. And so I studied insurgency and counterinsurgency tactics. And one of the tactics of an insurgency is you have to create parallel institutions to take over a society. That is, you have to create hospitals, schools. You have to prove you can run them. If you're going to make the case that you should be able to overturn legitimate authority. And this is what's happening now. New College is an example of this. But the first communications that I read about what was happening in New College concerned not the state authorities, but the private firm that Richard Corcoran is a part of, apparently, has been exulting, saying, this is a great thing for our firm. Richard Corcoran, I know he's on the board of directors of this firm. I don't know what the firm does, but they've been crowing about this. They're like, well, look, one of our own now is the head of a public college. Yeah, alarm bells.
Let's go to Anne Marie, if that's okay, on Zoom.
Hi, glad to hear what you have to say. And I'm very sympathetic to the last speaker because I think if you hire people to speak about gender studies and so forth, and then you basically sabotage their careers, we're, as a university, in big trouble. But what I wanted to ask you is the headline today about the College Board basically stripping the original African Studies AP placement class of many of the things that are controversial about it, including having individuals, well, I think you know what the controversies are regarding this, but what disturbs me about basically silencing a lot of what is important about contemporary issues in African studies and Black Lives Matters and so on is that this is an independent board. It's a nonprofit board that evidently folded as quickly as you could possibly imagine to the governor's point of view. And I wondered what you had to say about that as kind of validating where the governor is going with this.
That board did a terrible disservice through K through 12 teachers in this state who have been under siege for the last several years. I know this because some of those teachers are my former students at the University of Florida. They are passionate, younger people that go into, Hialeah High School, West Palm, Jupiter, and they want to make a difference with these kids. They want to teach science, math, history, social studies. And the decision of that board, I feel, was a terrible disservice to them. We've lost a lot of teachers in the past few years in Florida. And again, some of my former students, one who just left from Miami-Dade, she said, Professor Ortiz is just not worth it. She grew up in Miami-Dade, and she teaches Black studies and Hispanic studies. And she said, it's just not worth it because it takes one parent to destroy your career as a junior teacher. Your principal won't back you up. And what she told me, which was especially horrific, was the state of Florida has banned the 1619 curriculum on the study of slavery and U.S. history. And what this former teacher who's on her way to teach in California now told me was that, Professor Ortiz, you can't even mention the date 1619. We don't even mention that date because all it would take is one person to hear us and then accuse us of teaching the 1619 curriculum. And then we're gone. The principal's not going to back us up. So I think what the AP board did is abysmal. I work with a lot of school districts across the country. I've never worked directly with the AP board, but they know better than that because, here's when I put on my professor letter of recommendation, talk to HR, try to get my students a job hat. Our students now compete against Harvard students. Our students trying to get into grad school, med school, law school, their competition is the Ivy Leagues. They can't say, oh, well, we didn't read critical race theory or Kimberly Crenshaw or Toni Morrison because it may have made some people in Florida feel bad. This is why, as soon as, Anne-Marie, this is not to be flippant, but as soon as the ruling came out, I said about AP, African American Studies, I said, look, parents are going to start suing the state. Students are going to start suing the state because even from a surface base, it puts them at a competitive disadvantage with their peers in other states. Because I do work with enough school districts to know that these curriculums are very popular. Look, I work with a school district in Maryland, 250,000 students. They've taught African American studies for the past decade. They don't have any problems with it. They just teach it. It's a topic. They teach Asian American history. They teach women's history. Middle school kids are taking these topics. And so when their kids apply to get into college, I think they're looking pretty good.
Paul, what can we do as individuals? Because I'm not affiliated with any of the schools or the universities, there's nothing the governor can do to me. And I would really like to be able to speak up and defend what is right. And do you have an opinion on what newspapers we can write to?
Other folks might have, I mean, my opinion is right now, yeah, definitely. I mean, Tampa Bay, Tampa still has a great newspaper, Orlando, but I would also encourage you to always CC educational leaders. Make sure that we stay in contact with our local school board in Alachua County. Affirm these principles of what our students should be able to study. Always copy our dear colleagues in Tigard Hall, because we want to make sure, and especially we have an incoming president. I get asked this question all the time. Well, what are your hopes or fears about Ben Sass? And my thing is, we're going to educate Senator Sass. We want him to succeed, number one. We don't want him to flop. No one will benefit by that. We want him to thrive. But in order for him to do that, he has to learn how we build up this institution. Generations of administrators, faculty, staff, and students, and parents and alumni. So we want to give him the information he needs to be able to thrive as a president. And part of that is President Sass, these are the things we value the most about the Gator Nation. And we want to make sure you know that. And so that, yeah, I'm a big fan of, again, it's kind of my labor organizing background, communicating directly to people. Because if we don't communicate it, then, I mean, I'm privy to certain conversations that happen in Tallahassee. Sometimes I think some of this is gossip, a lot of times it is. But one of the conversations that someone shared with me was that at a recent governor's cabinet or quasi-cabinet meeting, one of his aides, actually, or one of his advisors actually said something to the effect, well, and I guess you don't speak directly to him. I don't know. But someone said, well, what does the governor think about, could this be seen as a violation of academic freedom? And the response was not from the governor, it was from another more senior aide who said, the people of Florida support the governor, otherwise they wouldn't have elected him. And so that is the illusion of consent. And that's the thing I think we got to break through. And that's where I think, again, the old school thing about, canvassing, letter writing, emails is very important. We didn't have any hope almost at all when the Anti-Woke Act was passed. And then one day, but see, the thing is, the union was able to work with the NAACP, the ACLU, women's rights groups, I mean, a whole coalition, faith-based groups, get involved in them. Our strongest supporters for the struggle for intellectual freedom at UF have been churches, synagogues, and mosques. All of those institutions have DEI statements. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in Florida, and so it's just so amazing to me when people talk to me, well, how, Paul, God, suddenly DEI is controversial. That's one of the things we have to break. DEI is not controversial. Every synagogue I go and talk to has a DEI committee, every single one. Because faith-based communities realize if you're in Florida, you've got to be inclusive, you've got to be welcoming. If you don't want to be diverse, then you move to another state where there's not diversity. I don't know what that would be now, but you know what I mean? So, yeah.
This will be our last question, Paul.
Last question. If the forces of the dark side make unacceptable demands upon the union on the new 3-year contract, lower, okay, and the contract expires, would the union membership consider a labor action as a possible result?
Well, there's a lot of options. One option,
specifically that one.
Okay. One option we do not have per the state constitution is we do not have the option of going on strike. But short of that, we've been able to make a lot of gains in the contract over the years. And now I'm speaking to a lot of former UFF officials, including one of our former presidents. A lot of the gains we make happen not when the contract is negotiated, but during the mundane, like everyday work that the grievance committee does. I mentioned also the bargaining committee is 24/7. Let me give you one example. So after President Trump was elected, one of the first things that happened was that Chinese faculty, not just at UF, but all throughout the state, began experiencing levels of harassment and racism that were just horrific. And I'm not going to get into all the details, but we were able to use the contract like right away to defend colleagues from being harassed and unjustly disciplined. The contract has a lot of language that if a faculty doesn't do their job, they can be disciplined, they can even be fired. We have tenured faculty who are fired. Part of the myth is that tenure is lifetime employment. There is no such thing in a capitalist society as lifetime employment. There is none. So anyway, I'm sorry, I'm getting off track, but there's a lot of things we can do, but because we don't have the right to strike over the decades, we've adopted kind of more of a public relations thing, like digging back and getting community supporters to approach the administration and to say that, well, if we want to keep good quality faculty, you're really going to have to support them. The contract could go to impasse. Like several years ago, it went to impasse over salaries. And we had very public hearings. And the problem with the way arbitration works here, and I apologize, this is kind of a labor and industrial relations thing. The problem with arbitration in Florida is that in many cases, the final arbiter of our contract when it comes to a controversy like, say, salaries, the final people that look at it are members of the Board of Trustees. So that's a challenge for us because we've even had outside arbitrators who will say, well, the faculty here should be paid a little better. If you're a top university and you say you're a top university, they should be paid at the level equivalent to their peers. And we've had our Board of Trustees being the final arbiter and essentially saying, thanks, but no thanks. So we lost that round. But in a way, we didn't lose because we used it as an educational moment for our own faculty. If we value the work we do, we have to value it. And we're going to come back next time and we're going to still fight for a better, salary condition. But in terms of actions, right now we're at the level of we can do anything, but we just cannot go on strike. What's that? We can all get sick. Yeah, there's a lot of things we can do, right? And I tell my fellow colleagues, I said, I can't tell you to do what to do, but you can do what you think is the right thing to do.
What a great presentation. Very powerful, very meaningful. Thanks for leading the discussion too.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. Oh, and I'll leave these flyers. Great public programs coming up February 13th at Smathers. February 13th at the Cotton Club, February 23rd at Smathers. Again, you can join us in person or in Zoom. Either one. We'll always love to have you.